spoilers. Hello everyone, welcome to the Eternal Spoiler Breakdown. My name is Pojo, and today we are going to be talking about a bunch of new spoilers coming out for the upcoming set. By the time you see this, the set will almost have been released. We are releasing February 11th, and we will be streaming all day with Echoes of Eternity. So you can find us on Twitch TV/LocoPojo. We will be playing with all of the new cards. We will be drafting with all of the new cards, probably quite a bit. And we are going to be like just fiddling around with new decks and trying new shenanigans and doing a lot of interesting things. So please do join us. It should be an all-day stream. We're going to have a delightful, delightful time. I'm really excited to do that. That'll probably start around 11 or 12 p.m. EST, depending on when the set actually releases. We might do a waiting room, or we might just hang out until we're ready and then get started. But either way, we're going to be streaming probably a good, I would say, 8 to 12 hours. So you'll definitely see us online for all of that, and I hope to see you there. So with that in mind, let's talk about some spoilers. We have a new market system. And also, the expedition cards have been announced, so the draft packs have been announced. We can see what's in the draft packs, and we now know like what's going to be in those sets and what isn't going to be in those sets. One of the most interesting things that isn't going to be in the sets is merchants. We do not have a merchant, and we do not have a smuggler. Instead, we have cards such as these, Blazing Salvo, which which cause you to swap cards from your hand with other cards in your black market. So you can keep cards in your black market, use cards like Blazing Salvo to fetch them, similar to how you would with a merchant, except instead of a 3-cost merchant, this is a 1-cost fast spell that has the restriction of not only does the card have to be in your black market, meaning you can't have it in your regular market or in your regular deck, but also it has to be a card of a particular cost. So that's going to be a really interesting restriction on markets in the whole set. Like expedition wise, we are just not going to see any smugglers of any kind, which means that markets are generally going to be changed up quite a bit. Red will always have 5 2-cost cards. Shadow will always have 5 1-cost cards, like so on and so forth. Basically, everybody will have a particular type of market with a particular set of tools that they can grab using these cards. And then, of course, in Throne, you can use whatever you want. And if you're playing smugglers, you can play both smugglers and salvos, or whatever it is you want to call these market spells, as they are currently called by Eternal. So yeah, let's go over them. They're all pretty interesting. They're all pretty powerful. Some are more powerful than others. I actually started with the one that I think may end up being the most powerful, which is Blazing Salvo. Blazing Salvo reads deal 2 damage to a unit as a fast spell, and you can swap a card from your hand with a 2-cost card in your black market. So it's a char with a market attached to it, meaning that you can very easily pick up any 2-drop that you want to set up for aggro, for example. If you want to just sort of organize your deck in a way that you can kill your first turn 1 unit and then immediately play down your best turn 2 unit, that could be really, really interesting. But more likely, you're probably going to be using Blazing Salvo to set up on units and deal with, more like in a fixing sense. If you're trying to pick up particular relics that you need to sort of access a particular part of their deck, for example, like going into Porcelain Mask or running into like something to just sort of power yourself up, like Power Stone in Throne, that's something that Blazing Salvo can do pretty easily. It can also get 2-drops that fix particular problems, of which there are quite a few. You can get things that are like curse related, or basically if you're looking into other colors, there's a lot of different options available. And so on and so forth. But like in general, like I think the power of these cards is also going to be determined by how useful they are as an effect. And Blazing Salvo has the most useful on-board effect for the deal 2 damage to a unit. Like that is probably the thing that's going to do the most in terms of that overall setup. Yeah, the current organization is Shadow 1, Fire 2, Justice 3, Primal 4, and Time 5, and we'll be looking at all of them. So Blazing Salvo, good removal that also attaches to a market. It seems pretty interesting. I'd say that it's probably going to set up for some nice aggro plays, and it's the most tempo efficient, which is really important for Fire, since Fire is trying to be a fairly aggressive option. Another one that's in a runner-up for very high strength is Transpose. Deal 1 damage to the enemy player, you gain an Aegis, and you can swap a card from your hand with a 4-cost card in your black market. So it kills Aegises on your opponent, it causes Aegises on you. It's not a great card to play except for access to your market, and I think that's the primary reason why this might not be terribly valuable in some situations, but 4 cost is definitely a good thing to be accessing in Primal, including things such as like Honor of Claws. Any of like the big scary relics are often at 4 cost. A lot of the big and important units are at 4 costs. This is a card that you can easily use to sort of basically just play on 3, similar to a smuggler, deal some damage, get an Aegis, and then play a 4-cost card that does something pretty wild and ridiculous. So I think it's pretty interesting, but I also think that it's the least powerful effect out of most of the options here. Gaining an Aegis is nice, particularly if you're playing a control setup, but because it is only the enemy player, Transpose is somewhat limited in its ability to generate value. Most merchants or smugglers will trade in order to get some sort of benefit. Transpose does not do either of these things. It breaks Aegises, which can sometimes be considered to be half a card, but I would value it less than half a card most of the time. It gives you an Aegis, which similarly can be valued as much as 1 card, but often sort of generally it sort of comes out as half of a card. And then after that, you get to swap a card, so you don't gain any cards from getting the 4-cost card from your black market. I think overall this card's value is pretty limited, which is kind of important because Primal really wants to have like very powerful market access, and this might be very limiting for it in terms of setting up its control setup. This might force Primal into a more aggressive stance, a lot more reliance on Elysian, that kind of thing. All of the Flame of Zolta cards are still in the draft packs, or at least still in Expedition, even if they aren't in the draft packs, so you will find them as legal regardless of whether or not you find them in a draft pack. So yeah, all of Elysian aggro is still around. Transpose can be used to fetch cards such as Daring Griffin and that kind of thing, but you do sacrifice a card to play it, so I'm skeptical that this one is going to be as powerful as some of the other options available. Condemn. This is a 1-cost with lifesteal that says deal 1 damage to an enemy. If it dies this turn, it gets void bound. You can swap a card from your hand with a 1-cost card in your black market. Now, there are a lot of good 1-cost cards to grab from your black market. You obviously have access to like your Sabotages and your Suffocates. You have your, if you're in Argenport, you have that card that I think it's called Shattered Hopes, that breaks Aegises and steals 4-cost or higher cards, which is pretty funny if your opponent has just played the Primal card but not played their 4-cost card yet. And also you have the option of playing, of course, really aggressive 1-drops or playing around with cards like Secret Passage. Plenty of interesting relics here for Condemn to grab for you. In addition, this card also kills stuff, similar to Vara's Favor. I don't know if I value it quite as highly as Vara's Favor, since Vara's Favor does put you up a card, but this is definitely something that, since it is your primary market access, you're probably going to be running it in Shadow, because you do need access to your black market, and this is something that Expedition is probably specifically going to be wanting if you are going to want to run a market. I think the question of whether or not you want to run a black market is a lot more interesting now, though. Certainly bargains are going to come into play a little bit more if you want to play with markets, because having better access to the market is going to be pretty relevant, seeing as a lot of your market cards are going to be basically set in 1 cost. It's going to be pretty hard to play them otherwise. Notably, like if you're running an all-shadow market, you can run a bargain card like Lethrai Dead Drop, but you can't run Condemn and the bargain card at the same time, or at least you can, but the Condemn card will not get the Lethrai Dead Drop. So kind of an interesting little synergy or anti-synergy between bargain cards and market cards in that respect. I think overall this is a nerf to markets, but it should make markets a lot more interesting and could potentially lead to some interesting values and potential options happening as a result of it. So yeah, that's one of the stronger ones. I think another one that is quite a bit stronger is the Time one, which we are trying to find right now since there are quite a few cards to be going over today. It is called Crack the Earth. Crack the Earth is 1-cost, play a 1/1 cultist, swap a card from your hand with a 5-cost card in your black market. Yeah, this one gets a lot done. You get the sacrifice target, which sometimes valuable is about half a card. You still get the ability to remove things at fast spell speed because you get to drop a 1/1 cultist in front of them, which if you have other buffs or other things that you can play around with, this may end up being a little bit more conducive to a kill spell. It can also allow you to play weapons in situations where you wouldn't otherwise be able to play weapons. Like, this is a card that definitely has a lot of strength in terms of its onboard ability, even kind of relatively close to the fire ability to take out units, particularly units with 2 or less health. I think this card is pretty reasonable. I think it's probably the best of the 5. I was going to say that the fire one was, but looking at it now, I actually think that like there's enough 3 health units in the game that people will play like a lot of 3 health units and generally be able to dodge around that fire market access, kind of reducing its value as a fast speed option. Whereas this one is something that like gets you access to a big old nasty nasty card in your black market, while also being like a pretty reasonable way to just play a fast cultist. And playing a fast cultist does quite a few things. You can ambush them out for Arc of Soul. You can mess around with, of course, anything that's attacking that has 1 health. You can sacrifice them to a large number of different targets, and all of that allows you to basically get like fast speed market access that is very, very powerful, and also happens to be the largest and most impactful of the market cards. 5 is a little bit of an awkward setup for market cards. They're often not all that easy to play, but if you're playing it on 4 and looking for your next 5 drop, that doesn't feel particularly bad. So I think that that's a pretty interesting setup. And then finally we have the Justice one. This is probably the weakest of the 3. It's called, of the 5. It's called Fearless Crescendo. It gives a unit flying permanently, which is definitely not a bad thing if you're trying to get across for damage or push a lot of different things. Like if you're looking for something along the lines of, say, I believe there's a 0/1 that actually just gives a unit flying that is just very, very powerful. This is kind of in that similar spot. The nice thing about Fearless Crescendo is that it does give you access to probably some of the most flexible black market options. The picture included with this one does include the Relic Shattering colorless card, which Justice always has access to in the market, but rarely ever uses. In this case, like, Justice can actually get it because you can get colorless cards with these cards. The color does not need to match, so you're quite capable of getting other things that you want. But obviously this can access Valkyries, it can access a wide variety of interesting removal spells. There's a lot of good stuff at 3 to sort of play around with, and so I think the market access here is pretty solid, even if the unit flying ability is maybe not quite as good. It does allow you to knock flyers out of the air if you have a big unit on the ground, but Justice's general sort of deal usually doesn't involve like not playing flyers or like having very big units on the ground while also having flyers in the air against your opponent. I don't know. I'm skeptical that this is going to be quite as valuable as some of the other ones in terms of what it can do. Still, like, giving a unit flying is pretty powerful. Maybe I'd rank it in the middle, but I'm probably more inclined to rank it towards the bottom over some of the other options. But yeah, costs 1, gets a 3-cost card, and like overall seems like it has a lot of value. Most Justice decks will be playing for these because like it's just really good access to a pretty important market, and Justice kind of needs access to the market to play a lot of their more interesting answers to different things, since Justice is a set or a color that is very concerned with what other people are doing and whether they are doing it properly. It will frequently have a lot of interesting and very unique answers to certain problems, which Fearless Crescendo certainly helps out with and does some interesting things with. Yeah, so that's the 5 market cards. I'm uncertain how I feel about these. My initial impression is that this will restrict markets to the point where they are really, really predictable. Like, I think that, you know, if you know exactly what cost the market card is going to be at, and your opponent is playing only one type of market card to get into their black market, then cards like these can potentially get into some weird situations where, like, you have like a very set market for every color, and it's not going to change too much. You're going to be able to predict markets very, very easily. In addition, like, this is a card that is always a 1-cost fast spell, which means that like it's pretty easy to know that it's there. You're fairly likely to see the pause for spells constantly, which does kind of irritate me. I actually like really don't like the pause function in Eternal because it doesn't have a strong signal. Like, you don't get to see when there is a pause unless you are looking for it, so it's kind of like a little bit weird if it's going to be pausing basically every turn. I'm not sold on these market cards at all. We will certainly see how they play. I imagine they'll be a little bit of fun, at least for the start, but overall this seems like it could be kind of a rough mechanic. I'm very skeptical that this is going to turn out all that well in terms of what kind of gameplay it's going to encourage and what kind of like value it's going to be like adding to the game. We'll see. Certainly there's all sorts of interesting possibilities for sideboarding, but this being our only sideboarding option makes for an interesting sort of set. I'm really curious to see how it all turns out. Okay, so yeah, that's all the fast spell market cards. There are some pretty powerful cards in there. Let's talk about all the spoilers. There's a ton of them, and I haven't gone through them in a while, so we got quite a few to go through. For example, some of you, if from the Reddit, probably know Pillar of Progress. 2 cost, time and justice, +1 maximum power. When you play a relic weapon, it gets +1 strength. Great card if you are trying to play a lot of relic weapons, which, by the way, there are a ton of relic weapons in the upcoming format, and red, green, yellow has a relic weapon theme. So basically a lot of that stuff is getting cycled into the draft packs. We're going to be seeing access to Claw of the First Dragon, Sword of the Sky King. We're going to be seeing a lot of like the 6-drop cards, the 0/6 that's armor equal attack equal to its armor is back in. We have Blade Breaker. We have like just a wild pile of interesting stuff, as well as some new cards coming in that are very, very exciting in terms of relic weapons. Armory is back in a big way, and it's going to be back with a little bit of yellow splashed onto it. So Pillar of Progress could be a potentially very powerful option to add on to that list and get you access to some really powerful relics. I think there are a lot of things it can definitely do with an extra strength. This is a Whetstone plus, and the plus is really, really important here. When you combine 2 cards together to get 1 benefit and you don't increase the cost of the card at all, I think that's potentially going to be something that's pretty excellent. And Power Stone, already a very powerful card. Whetstone, not a very powerful card, but when you smash the 2 together and you still have a 2-cost card, that's going to be something that might end up being a format staple for Expedition. I think this card has a lot of potential. Soul Drain Smithing. All right, they are never the right size, are they? We will just fit to screen. 2 costs. Draw a weapon from your void. It and each weapon in your deck get +1 strength. So if you got a weapon in your void, which is not always the easiest thing, but is certainly possible, Talon of Nostrix is available in the draft pack, so it's pretty easy to get at least 1 relic weapon into your void fairly quickly, so you can do some wild stuff with that. But yeah, Soul Drain Smithing allows you to get some cheap weapons very quickly and also buff all of your weapons with a little bit of value. Overall, not that bad of a card, certainly very situational, but could be a lot of help if you are looking for like a sort of high armor armory deck with a little bit of like extra strength attached. Strange Tracker. The strangers in this format are all very good, and I actually forgot to check in Expedition if strangers were cycling in. I don't believe that there are going to be a lot of strangers in the Expedition packs, but I will double check that in just a second. Either way, Strange Tracker, when a player plays a stranger, it goes Berserk. So this one is a 2/4 with Berserk. Like, it just has Berserk as a result of its ability. Pay 3 and exhaust Strange Tracker to draw a dragon of your choice from your deck that you haven't played this game. We've already established that these stranger abilities do happen when you summon them. So like, yeah, you do get the immediate effect of having a 2/4 Berserk for 4, which not unreasonable. There is a 2/4 Berserk for 4 in double red that is almost playable, and this one is kind of already in that spot. But pay 3 and exhaust to draw a dragon of your choice from your deck that you haven't played this game. That's a really powerful ability. You get to pick up lots and lots of cards. Those cards have a lot of extra value. If you're playing cheap dragons, it makes it a lot easier. If you have a lot of different ways to gain power, then this becomes like an endless value engine for dragons that could be very, very good. And on top of that, it buffs all of your other strangers in a pretty useful way. I would say that it's not an insanely powerful card in Expedition, and it's not even going to be playable in Throne, but it's certainly fun, and there's some interesting possibilities with it that could be kind of okay. The Berserk ability on it in particular is pretty wild. All right, Blazing Salvo, that one we already did. That is our market card. I like how that's even bigger than the last one. Dragons. We got Mightiest Leyline Dragon next. All right. Mightiest Leyline Dragon is a 5/5 flying overwhelm for 6. When you play a power card, create and draw a treasure trove. When you play a spell, Mightiest gets, or when you draw a power card, create and draw a treasure trove. When you play a spell, Mightiest gets strength equal to the cost of that spell this turn. So it's a flying overwhelm unit that generally gets in for something like 7 to 8 damage a turn. You're very likely to be playing spells on top of Mightiest because you're going to be at least running treasure troves, which could be pretty wild and generally is going to be pretty interesting. It also turns all of your power cards into a treasure trove, which is not an innately useful card on its own, but does translate into card advantage over time, as is the case with most dragons, this card just really scales out of control very quickly if you have ways to reduce the cost of the treasure troves or to gain a lot of power all at once. So fun, extremely greedy dragon should be a really fun card in like Praxis or Zolta Arcanum type decks where you are trying to get like red, green, yellow stuff happening or other things like that. As a staple in like other dragons like red, purple, blue, the standard dragon colors, I don't know if this one is quite as useful, but dragons can be anywhere, and this is actually potentially a good option for those like late game dragon decks that really want to do some interesting fun stuff with a lot of different power. Shardbinder, Overwhelm. The ability is that the first Relic spellcraft or Relic ability that you play, come on, where are you? There you are. It costs 3 less, and it's a 3/1 Overwhelm for 2. So not too bad on damage. Definitely get some interesting power going on. If you play this down and then you immediately go into the 3 cost that gives you Lost in the Mist, then you've got a 3 cost Power Stone that also triggers Lost in the Mist and removes one of your opponent's units. So that kind of relic-based aggro deck clearly has some potential. The card is very vulnerable, especially since Shadow has access to a market card that deals 1 damage, and Fire has access to another market card that deals 2 damage. Both of those market spells mean that Shardbinder is less likely to be played in some situations, but clearly if you're trying to run a Relic spellcraft ability type setup, like this is something that really leads into itself. If the deck is strong, then the card is strong. If it isn't, then it isn't. I think that overall the card's stats are probably not enough to carry it into Throne and might make it even a little bit too weak for Expedition, but it certainly has the potential to get there in Expedition if you got the right things going on. Savas Stranger. When a player plays a stranger, it deals 3 damage to a non-stranger enemy. Ooh, glorious, great, wonderful. Deals damage when you play it. It's a 7 cost 9/6, so that's a little bit less great, but certainly does mean that you have essentially a ground-based Rezon in red, which I don't think is necessarily unreasonable. When it attacks, you get +1 power this turn for each of your units, which is absolutely insane if Savas Stranger lives, which it is not likely to do since it is a single color unit that costs 7 and doesn't have Aegis or any sort of survivability. But if it does live, yeah, you'll probably kill your opponent with it righteous quick. So solid option if you can actually figure out some way to protect this card. At the very least, the card gets you a little bit of value Rezon style. It's a little too expensive to, I would say, be as powerful as Rezon, and Rezon's lifesteal was also a very important part of this. Like, this is not competing with Throne cards like Ikaria for any particular reason, but it is a really interesting stranger that seems like it's going to be a powerhouse in Expedition, since 7 drops in Expedition, if you can get to them, are quite ridiculous. But on the other hand, you often can't get to them, and they kind of need to be stabilizing cards considering how swingy the format is. Previously, we have had a lot of like mastery decks, that kind of thing. Most of the 7 drops were cards that killed and also gave lifesteal, or like basically like completely stabilized the board in some way. So this sort of minor value on a big unit, I'm not sure if it's going to be strong enough for Expedition. We will certainly see if it can do anything. Unseen Longbow, quick draw pledge. Let's go ahead and stretch that sucker to screen. Okay, when the wielder hits the enemy player, they lose their remaining power, and you get that much power this turn. Spellcraft 3, play Hold Up. This is one of my favorite cards in the set of spoilers that we are seeing right now, just because it is a really interesting value card. You get the pledge off of it, which is a big deal. The quick draw ability is really fun. It's not like anything that increases the survivability of the unit, but because the card can play Hold Up on top of it, you can also not lose anything from playing it if you are running it out later into the game. Because it plays Hold Up, it can discard 2 cards from your opponent's hand, which ends up being pretty ridiculous and usually completely empties out their hand after you have played the cards. So that's pretty interesting. Also, when it hits the enemy player, they lose their remaining power, and you get that much power this turn. This card steals a lot of things. I don't know why it's a Longbow, but hey, there you are. Overall, I think it's like a really interesting like thieving weapon. There's a lot of fun things that you can do with it, and I think the risk-reward aspect of this is really interesting. I could see this card being played in Throne. It doesn't have a lot of stats attached to it, but the amount of things that you're stealing on your turn, if your opponent is tapped out and not like basically like paying attention to the idea of Unseen Longbow, makes this a fascinating market card in Throne, and also potentially something that could be pretty ridiculous in other stuff. It is also one of the first weapons with Pledge, which yeah, is certainly a cool thing, but not anything that we didn't expect, I would say. All right, following that, we have Yojimbo Ghostblade. This card's a bit more of a trap. 0/6, strength equal to your maximum power. When it hits the enemy player, draw 2 cards. When the enemy player plays a unit, which they're going to play a unit, they silence Yojimbo. If you can give this card charge and get the 2 cards off of it, yeah, it's pretty good. I mean, you get to smack them for 6, and then you get to draw 2 cards. If they play a unit, it's a 0/6 wall, which is not that useful. And I don't know what situation they don't play a unit in. So I'm uncertain if this has any particular value. You can give it Aegis to prevent the silence once, but when every unit is a Valkyrie Enforcer, that card's going to go down pretty fast. And also it can just be chump blocked by units that currently exist, or removed by removal spells if your opponent is playing spells. I don't think this card is good, but maybe there's some potential for it. Lita's Apprentice does like prevent it from being silenced. Even then, I don't think it's really like trading all that well. There's a lot of interesting options there. I think it's just unlikely to be a good option in anything but the Justice market as a choice that you could like sort of pick up if your opponent is playing unitless, but then it still gets removed. Yeah, I don't know. I'm really skeptical that this card has any particular value. Essence Feast. Deal 1 damage to each unit. Lifesteal while the enemy player has 10 or more cards in their void. Deadly when they have 20 or more. So a complete Wrath if you have milled enough things to give it both lifesteal and deadly. The lifesteal is kind of fun. You actually get a pretty interesting life force trigger if you have 10 or more cards in void, which is not as hard to trigger as the deadly trigger. I would say that this does make a mill deck very, very irritating. It doesn't really belong anywhere else though, so I'm kind of just not into the design. I really don't want a mill deck to have a Wrath, and this mill deck gets a cheap Wrath, so yeah, I'm really not into it. But hey, it is a really fun card if you play it when they have 10 cards. I just like the ability to deal a bunch of damage to a bunch of different units and gain life. That is like a really satisfying experience, and like, yeah, overall it seems kind of cool in that respect. You can also give it deadly with time cards or anything along those lines, or double damage for that matter. There are a lot of different ways to give spells different bonuses here, and Essence Feast is something that can benefit from spell damage in ways that you would generally be able to take advantage of. So maybe you'll be able to get a spell damage deck that can like steal a bunch of life with it, and that could be kind of fun. Unseen Execution. Kill each unit with fewer than 2 battle skills. It's a Wrath that works really well if you are playing Unseen, which will have a bunch of battle skills. It costs 6, so it's probably not going to see a ton of play, but Expedition, you're going to probably have a decent amount of Unseen out. You'll kill most of your opponent's units. You'll have 1 Unseen left. They'll remove it. Maybe it's okay. It's a decent amount of hoops to jump through for Wrath, and like the Wrath is itself at least very good. It's very rare for Argenport to have a Wrath, so this is something that's kind of interesting. But I think this kills enough. This doesn't kill enough things that is potentially unplayable in both Throne and Expedition. Like, it's very possible that the format just shifts towards more battle skill units, and then Unseen Execution is a dead card that you can't pick up in the market because there's no particular way to do that in this format. Savage Incursion. We've got a fit to screen. Deal 3 damage. If the enemy player has 10 or more cards in their void, draw 3 cards. If they have 20 or more, play 3 6/4 dragons with flying and overwhelm. So once again, we have this like really interesting mill setup. This one I'm totally in favor of. If you turn your mill into dragons, then that's a win con that isn't mill. And also like 3 sapphire dragons and a bunch of damage to somebody's face is just really satisfying. I think that this should be like sort of the end goal of most mill decks. I really like to see mill decks where you're trying to enable a threshold rather than trying to mill people to death, and Savage Incursion gets that job done beautifully. It's also gorgeous card art, and it's got to be an incredibly satisfying card to play. This looks like a ton of fun, and I also think it's decently powerful. Should see play in both Throne and Expedition in some small amount, but basically you do have to run a decent amount of mill to get there, so Throne not going to have it as much as the other format. CarVet Redeemed, 6/6 flying. When CarVet deals damage, gain red, blue, and purple, your dragon colors. At the end of each player's turn, CarVet deals 1 damage to them. So you play it out, at the end of the turn it immediately deals 1 damage to you, or which then gives you red, blue, and purple together, which allows you to play your dragons more easily. This card fixes your dragons pretty well, so I think there's actually some purpose to it. It also is just like going to get you a ton of influence in all 3 colors, so like maybe if you can play CarVet Redeemed over and over again, you can even do something silly like run all of the warp cards or something like that, although they are cycling out of Expedition, so that seems a little bit unlikely. Overall, I think this card's fixing ability and its general like sort of nightmare ability, this card is much more useful than it looks. It's certainly no CarVet previous, the 4 or 5 CarVet, but it's a lot of stats for a 5 cost unit, like a very large flyer in general, and the damage that it deals is very relevant, as is the influence that it gains. I think that like this card can potentially get you into some crazy situations, and if you give it lifesteal or do some interesting things with the damage dealing, yeah, this card's gonna get kind of crazy kind of fast. I don't know, I'm not sure. It is certainly a card that does not have like any sort of onboard impact beyond that influence gain, but that influence gain might be enough to actually justify keeping it. Grodos Burton. Single faction units have exalted. Play Bury the Past with Spellcraft 3. Pay 5 to draw a card. If it's a single faction unit, play it. So, a lot of useful text, all of which requires you to have a lot of power. High risk, very good reward. Obviously, if you can play this at 8, then you get a Bury the Past out of it. That's something that you're probably even going to be happy with in Throne. The pay 5 ability is usable over and over again. It's not once per turn, so I think this card's just kind of insane in Throne. Like, it basically allows you to play dozens and dozens of single faction units, and as long as you are playing enough power, you can just continue to just slam them over and over again, which is, yeah, that's like a crazy Ironthorn build at the very least. In Expedition, this card's a little bit harder to access, but certainly if you can ramp to it, you're going to have a fun time with it. It's kind of an equivalent to Kairos. I think there's some real potential for this card, but the fact that you can't play some of your hybrid cards might be a limiting factor into how much play it sees. Hammerhand. 10-5, deal 5 damage to 2 enemies for 8 with Corrupted 5, which means that once it dies, you can play that ability again for 5 for the next 5 turns, which is, yeah, that's a lot of value on a single unit. This is a card you're going to really want to get in draft packs, because like 4-8, you can't really get in your money's worth. This is like a Twin Flame on crack. It's got a lot of really interesting things happening with it. I think this card's reasonably strong. Should see a lot of play in Expedition, not any good in Throne. It's just doing too little there. But the damage dealing that it is doing is great. The stat line on it is hilarious. I really like this card. It's a lot of fun to play. It should be a great limited card and could be really interesting in that particular respect. Hammer of Unity, 2 cost, 2-0. The wielder is invulnerable to damage on your turn. Units that share a type with the wielder cost 1 less. Kind of an interesting aggro card for Compre aggro. There's some things I don't love about it, but at the very least it makes the units in your deck cheaper, so it's not another even-handed card, which is, I don't know. I'm just done with even-handed. But anyways, wielder is invulnerable to damage on your turn, and like stuff happens. It's kind of aggressive, certainly not unreasonable to allow you to get access to mastery. I think it's a solid mastery card in general and does do some interesting things, but the stats that it provides probably don't give you enough value in Throne, as the invulnerability to damage is not going to be as big a deal there. But overall, seems like a really interesting aggressive combo card. We'll see if it gets played into. Yeah. So we got Jade Horn here. 3-3, Warcry Pledge. I love this card. Is a Minotaur. You gain 3 armor, and your avatar can attack an additional time this turn when you summon it, and Corrupted 6, meaning you can play that ability to attack an additional time for 6 the next time around, and you'll get extra armor on top of that. Solid Armory Enabler. Has Warcry, which is great. Has Pledge, which is even better. This card has so many different avenues of attack. It is a solidly statted unit that also has Pledge, which means it fixes your power. It has Warcry, which means that it buffs your units, and it has the ability to make you attack additional times each turn, while also giving you additional health while being played. The raw value of this card is stronger than almost any other 3-drop that I have seen. It just attacks so many different axes. This is an insanely powerful card. I think you should definitely play it. I don't even know that you need to play it in Armory to play it well. It's really, really good. There's a lot of good things happening there. Okay. Other powerful 3-drops are going to be up, but we first have Kosovo Melee Virtuoso, which is... Doop. 2-1, play a Relic weapon, play a +1 weapon with Overwhelm on Kosovo. Ultimate, pay 4 to invoke fire. Which, hey, yeah, that's cool. Pay 4 to invoke fire sounds like a fun ability. This is kind of a neat little aggressive unit. I think it's got some modest value. You're not going to get the invoke too often, but in situations where Kosovo is stalled out and you can't really do anything with him, at the very least you're getting card advantage off of him, and it's kind of a fun card to play on 5 because, like, it is a 1-drop that you can play on 5 and not feel too bad about. Overall, I think this card's pretty strong. Definitely does some interesting things in aggressive decks, and then, like, when you cap out, you probably cap out around 5, so being able to invoke fire and get your choice of fire cards makes it have some nice late-game value, gives you a lot of consistency to an aggressive deck. Overall, seems like a pretty strong one, should be playable in Expedition for sure, obviously good in Draft, and Throne-wise, yeah, sure, I think we'd love it. Monument Curator. Strength and health equals the highest cost among your relics unless it gets silenced, in which case it's a 1-1 Tinker. This is the only Tinker I think that we've seen in Flame of Zolta, or in the Zoltan landscape, and yeah, kind of interesting. Overall, I think that this card certainly has some strength with relic-based decks, doesn't have strength anywhere else. Probably not likely to make it into Throne, but Expedition will have some relic-based decks to play around with. There is an entire, like, sort of armory-based setup at the very least that could kind of have some fun with it, but there's also some stuff that cares specifically about high-cost relics that will probably have a decent time with this card. Mysterious Waystone, because who doesn't love a Waystone? At the end of the cursed player's turn, deal a damage to him and gain 1 health. That is a win condition all by itself that will slowly bleed out your opponent in control lists. Kind of important. When you sacrifice a unit, increase this ability by 1. That is horrific. Yeah, this card is really gonna get the advantage over your opponent as long as you are sacrificing units and using them to do things like Combust, playing Soul's Fury, doing any sort of removal. Yeah, this card's gonna get pretty wild pretty fast. There's a lot of interesting things that you can do with it. I would say that it's a very interesting control card that is clearly a staple in a particular type of sacrifice deck, purple, red, and yellow. But it is also pretty expensive, so, like, the one thing that could put shit out of those decks is its cost. I don't know if it is justifiable when thrown at 5 cost. Portal Keeper, a 0/9. At the start of your turn, sacrifice Portal Keeper to play an elemental with strength and health equal to your armor. If you are already getting armor, that's kind of fun. The relic weapon can be given attack through a variety of different means, so certainly kind of fun there. Obviously, the stats are there, but, like, is the card good? I am skeptical. Overall, this card looks like it's one of those, like, sort of Justicey trap cards, similar to Secret Weapon, Plated Demolisher, Last Stand at the Gate. There's one of them in almost every set, and this one is probably the trap card for this set. Regent's Blade is another one. Yeah, this one seems like it's got some potential, certainly, but it is also, you're trying to set up a turn to get a single unit that is not very good. So I'm not into it. If you can give it a lot of attack, though, then I'm perfectly into it, because then you've got, like, a really nice high armor unit that turns into a smaller unit after you use it as a removal. So if you're playing this in an armory deck where you're actually, like, buffing the attack of your relics, this is something where you get, like, a 2/9 weapon that can clear a couple of things, keep you on a little bit of health, force your opponent to attack in, then you get a tiny elemental, and you feel pretty good about the value on it. If you're trying to play this just to play a big elemental, why? Because, like, I don't know, I just don't really love Justice cards that play really, really big, completely blank units, because those units never do anything interesting. But, like, yeah, certainly if you go for this on the other side of things, where you're trying to go all in on Portal Keeper, I think you're probably falling into a trap, but this card might have a little bit more value if you're using it as a removal spell to force your opponent to attack in. So, yeah, there's some potential there. Hammer of Glory. Your weapon can attack sites, probably the most important text that has been printed on a relic weapon. When your avatar attacks a unit, silence it, which also is very, very good and allows you to kill Borderlands lookouts with outright glee. The stat line on this card is very good. It is one of the more solid 5-cost weapons that we have seen. It's got a lot of good stats on it. The damage on it isn't all that great, but there are a couple of different ways to power up that damage in the format. So, yeah, This is a really powerful relic weapon that should see play in both Throne and Expedition. I can see running this in just like standard like Valks, just because the amount of different things that this can do for your Valk deck is pretty powerful when you're just trying to lead into an Ikaria. I think this is a staple 5-drop for Throne, and probably Expedition as well, depending on what Expedition is trying to do. There's some really cool things you can do with it. It's probably better than Auric Runehammer at this point, because Auric Runehammer has kind of like fallen out of favor due to a wide variety of other different things that are happening. But this is removal that kills stuff and gives you a lot of extra health on top of that. And like, yeah, it's pretty reasonable for what it's doing. And the silence ability and sight attacking ability give you a lot more flexibility than Auric Runehammer is giving you, which is kind of the thing that Auric Runehammer fell out of favor for, was the lack of flexibility. Strange Ally. 2/2, when a player plays a stranger, they play a 1/1 curse, -1/-1 curse on a non-stranger enemy unit. Pay 2 to exhaust Strange Ally and give one of your units a random battle skill. So it's a little crown buddy. I'm totally in favor of this card. It's obviously pretty poorly statted, but the -1/-1 curse is very, very good. I mean, there was a time when we would play Amethyst Acolyte and be pretty happy with it. I don't think that time is now, but if you're playing a bunch of strangers, this is clearly a pretty interesting option. And I like random battle skills. This should be very, very fun in draft environments. It's not amazing in Throne, and it's kind of fun in Expedition, potentially even powerful depending on what you're building towards. I think that Purpose is probably going to be the most undersold and underpowered of the particular factions, and this Stranger doesn't really convince me otherwise, but there are some potential options there that we will have to be fiddling around with. I think I missed Kadosh's Stranger and Calibrate here. So Kadosh's Stranger is a 2/2 that when a player plays a Stranger, the top unit or weapon of their deck gets strength and health equal to that Stranger's strength and health. When Kadosh's Stranger attacks, double his strength and health. So you get a 2/2 bonus, just an instant war cry when you play the card, which probably good enough to play Kadosh's Stranger. When it attacks, you get a 4/4. If you safe return this card, then you can buff the units and weapons on your deck even more. Overall, the amount of stats this card is giving mean it's probably a very powerful Stranger. I think that this card is playable in Throne and Expedition under the right circumstances. If you're buffing this card up, you can get some pretty wild benefits from it, like the turn 1 Tinker Apprentice into turn 3 Kadosh Stranger into like turn 4 like whatever you want with a 4/4 bonus or a 3/3 bonus is kind of interesting. There's some potential options there. I think the buffs on it could be transferred in ways that are pretty interesting, and also like this card plays with other strangers to give you even more buffs, so there's certainly some value there. Imagine playing this down in a deck where you are also playing the like 7/6 Stranger, and you get an idea of how bonkers it can be with the top of your deck. But also similar to like Ikaria buffs, the top of your deck is not always safe or even like reliable, so you do have to get other things done, and this card is one of those 3-drops that doesn't get anything done on board until it has attacked successfully. Calibrate, draw a relic or power card from the top 5 cards of your deck, put the rest on the bottom. Very frequently gets a power card, almost all the time in fact, so generally going to be played in place of Seek Power. Also picks up relics, which is pretty important if you're playing relic weapons in Time, Fire, and Justice, or just relics in general, which I believe is another tri-faction option. Yeah, this card's very good, should be a staple in both Throne and Expedition for any deck that wants to play a lot of relics. It's cheap, it's easy to play, and you get really, really good benefits from it. You might even play it in Rat Cage, although Rat Cage has a lot of different things that it wants to be doing, so it might not be doing quite as much of that cycling. Static Discharge. This card's barely worth mentioning, but when the cursed player plays a spell or attachment, they deal 1 damage to themselves. Cursed Relic, so does sort of slowly bleed your opponent out, doesn't give you any health in exchange, which was sort of the advantage of the Mysterious Waystone, but it is a little bit cheaper on that front. Overall, I think this card's going to get removed pretty frequently, and when it isn't going to get removed, your opponent's going to figure out some way to power through it. It has no onboard advantage. It's probably a fairly weak card, but who knows, maybe you could curse somebody out with it, and that could be quite a bit of fun. Overall, I don't think I'd want to pick it in draft. I don't think I'd want to play it in Expedition or Ranked, and I don't love the design. Damara, Def Saboteur. This is one of the more exciting 2-drops that we've seen. 3/1 ambush, unblockable while attacking sites. Ultimate, pay 5 to draw a card of your choice from the enemy player's market. Less useful now that we know that the markets are going to be really specific, but still a card that is a 3/1 ambush, which means that it is a removal spell at 2. Unblockable while attacking sites means that it is a removal spell for sites, which is also good. And ultimate, pay 5 means that you can play it at 7 to get a card back while you are playing it. Not only that, that card's going to be a card of your choice from your opponent's market, which means that you're probably going to get a really powerful card that may end the game. Yeah. This card's bonkers. You play it in Throne, you play it in Expedition, you play it in Draft. It's absolutely ridiculous. It covers all of the different setups. The health isn't really an issue since you're using this most of the time to kill a unit. If you get it to attack a site with it, great. And if you don't get to attack a site with it, it's probably because you were playing it to grab a card from your opponent's market, or were playing it to kill a unit. Either way, you're getting value off of it. This seems like a staple 2-drop and could even be played like as the staple 2-drop in Throne from now on. There's some pretty crazy stuff happening with it. It's very, very powerful. Flame Bathe Reformation. Once per turn, you may pay 2 to give one of your units Exalted, then sacrifice it. Really nice little option. Not maybe... it's similar to like Brimstone Altar, but it does cost a little bit more. Enables sacrifice triggers, gives you very, very big units that are kind of like somewhat susceptible to removal, so you can't really base your strategy on that Exalted ability, but nonetheless you get to really kind of build up your units in a really cool way. I think this is a lot more interesting than the one that smashed 2 units together to create a nightmare. Basically you're just playing units as weapons on top of other things. Like imagine playing this on an Ikaria. You just get an Ikaria weapon with all of the buffs and the Aegis off of the Ikaria, which is kind of fun. Yeah, there's just like some interesting things you can do with it. I think that this card's pretty interesting and exciting. The cost of it is pretty prohibitive, so I'm not sure if it's value in Throne. Expedition, yeah, I mean, you have some sacrifice strategies that you're perfectly happy to play with. This seems like it's something that could see play, and in Draft this card is super fun and going to create a lot of problems for your opponent that they can't really solve. So all right, that leaves all the spoilers that have the smaller images. We did those last, so we've got a couple more, but we're almost through them. Let's just hide these now, and we'll talk about the smaller spoilers. We've already seen all the displays. We're actually getting through most of the cards now. Arcane Restraint is next, and apparently... here we go. Didn't quite do it right. Spoilers. 1 second. We have a slight issue that will be resolved within a moment. And there we are. Okay, Arcane Restraint. 4 cost. Cursed player can't play more than 1 spell each turn. When they draw a card, you gain a health. Simple enough. Certainly does limit the ability of spell-based decks to do some interesting things. Those decks can still remove it with merchants, but also that does require them to play a spell to get the market card that destroys the relic. Also, relic destruction is a lot harder because market access is a lot more limited. I think that relics have a lot of potential to be very powerful in this format, and this card could be something that actually does restrict a real control deck while also being a potential market card for Primal. So if you're playing a blue deck that wants to grab this card, that seems like a really interesting option. If you're playing a time deck, I don't think you mainboard it. Savas Stranger, 7/7, 4/6. When you play a Stranger, play a random sigil from your deck. So 6 cost 7/7 that immediately ramps you to 7. That's very similar to the 7 cost card that plays a power and gets you a 1/1 unit. That kind of effect is really powerful and does allow you to play some really expensive cards in your deck because your 6 drops ramp you to your 7 drops. If you're playing it with other Strangers, great, but like by and large this card does something similar to like Worldbear Behemoth or Ravid Insect Master, and it does it at 6, and I think that's kind of important. The fact that it doesn't give you a flying blocker is a little bit interesting, but overall this card should see play in Throne and Expedition. It's a powerful enough Stranger. When it attacks, shuffle a void of your choice into its owner's deck, then draw 2 cards. If you give this charge with Talir's option, then you can steal your opponent's void at a time when they are trying to actually get something to happen. You can even do it at 5 because Talir's, the Praxis Arcanum, that's what I'm thinking of, gives Accelerate to the Stranger and also makes it cost 5, meaning you can play a 7/7, attack with a 7/7, get a power off of the 7/7, steal the opponent's void, rendering their Vara and their Azendel and whatever they have in their moot, draw 2 cards, and then the 7/7 crashes into a deadly unit, and you at least remove that unit from the board. That's That's a lot. That card is really good in Throne. It's very good in Expedition. This is a really, really powerful Stranger. It might be the most powerful of the 5 legendary Strangers. It's quite solid. There's a lot of things you can do with it, and if Praxis Arcanum is in the set, which I actually am not sure if that is true or not, then you get some pretty good benefits from it. That's the only other small spoiler I have, so that actually means that we are at the end of this. It only took us 45 minutes. But we got through all of them. I had a bit of a backlog. There are probably a few that I missed. We will do a full breakdown at some point, but for the most part, I think we've gotten through a lot of the cards that are coming out from the overall set. My impression is that this might be a little bit weaker set than some of the ones that we have seen. I still think that Expedition should be a really fun format, so I'm excited to see exactly what happens in there. I'm not wildly excited for any of these cards in Throne. I don't think it's going to be a terribly interesting format in some of those ways, so I don't know. I'm curious to see how it all pans out. I'm certainly hoping that it's going to be a ton of fun. I'm very excited to be playing new cards and playing with new things, and yeah, we'll see exactly how things go. Overall, there's a lot of interesting designs in this set, and we should see whether or not they're going to be fun to play in just one day. So tune in tomorrow. We are going to be playing live. Once again, Twitch TV/LocoPojo. Thank you all so much for watching, and we're going to call it a night now. So have a good one. As always, you can subscribe down below. You also can subscribe to me on Twitch, particularly if you have Amazon Prime, in which case you have a free subscription that you can use just by pressing the purple button above. And that is, I think, it. So thanks all. You can find me on Twitch, Twitter, YouTube, and Patreon, all under LocoPojo. Thank you once again, and have a lovely evening. Cheers.